Go ahead and get started. So I want to thank everybody for coming to this session on diversity and social justice, the pandemic's impact, and the opportunity to foster a just and inclusive environment. We have Dr. Luz Randolph, who's here at Louisiana State, and she's our Associate Vice Provost for Diversity. So I am going to mute myself, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Randolph.
Awesome.
Oh, one more thing. So she will be taking questions at the end, not in the chat, but you will unmute you if you have. Just hit the reactions button with the hand raised, and then I can get to you.
Well, thank you so much, Carol, and thank you everyone for being here today. I am pretty much an engaging type of individual. I like discussion. I will take a few minutes to share some thoughts, and then afterwards, as Carol mentioned, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask questions. Throughout the discussion, there may be some triggering statements being made, so I want to make sure I give that statement in advance. And again, if you want to share anything on your chat, please feel free to do so. I will not be engaging the chat during the talk, but I will certainly try to visit that at the end. So with that, I am going to kick it off. Diversity and social justice, the pandemic's impact on current efforts and the opportunity to foster a just and inclusive environment. The COVID-19 pandemic drastically changed every sector of our global community. One of the many consequences of COVID is an unveiling of the degree to which there are pervasive structural racial inequities in all sectors of our country, including in higher education, where students and communities of color continue to face issues with equal access. In 2020, when school closures began due to the pandemic, it meant that students from low-income and single-parent families, immigrant, refugees, ethnic minorities, and indigenous backgrounds with diverse gender identities, sexual orientations, and those with special education needs who are more risk of increased vulnerability, suffered by being deprived of physical learning opportunities, social and emotional support available in schools, and extra services such as on-campus housing, healthcare, or access to the student food pantry. Closures led to considerable effects on students' sense of belonging to school and their feelings of self-worth, which are key for inclusion in education. The spring 2020 transition to remote learning and work models illuminated the importance of addressing the different needs across these populations. Tackling these inequities required real-time strategies and solutions that would endure over time. While issues of inequity and COVID-19 dominated every college campus, things came to an abrupt stop when we witnessed the murder of George Floyd, an African-American man, by a police officer in Minneapolis. Nearly instantly, matters that were the core emphasis of our community became of intense global interest. During this time, our students pretty much knew that if you're Black in America, and especially if you're a Black male in America, it wasn't safe to go birding in Central Park, to meet friends at a Philadelphia Starbucks, to pick up trash in front of your own home in Colorado, or to go shopping almost anywhere. The health pandemic shone light to a pandemic our country has been witnessing for years, the racial pandemic. Such pandemic is taking a heavy psychological toll on our BIPOC community, but especially our Black African-American citizens. The health consequences were dire for our students and community. Racism is associated with a host of psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, and other serious, sometimes debilitating conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorders, all of which have an incredible impact on student success. Pandemic relevant research offers key lessons as the education system responded to the coronavirus crisis. Research regarding online learning and teaching shows that they are effective only if students have consistent access to the internet and computers, and that those in charge of teaching were trained and supported accordingly. Seems simple, but think back to March 2020 when the thought was, let's get all our courses online, with the made assumption that all students had access to computers and reliable access to internet, and that our educators were prepared and equipped with the resources necessary to be successful. This thought alone highlighted the assumption and the privilege that higher education lives in. Research also showed that a lack of contingency planning exacerbates the negative impacts of recessions, natural disasters, and pandemics on learning. The education system, including higher education, was simply unprepared to go fully remote overnight, and our students' ability to learn was challenged. Higher education institutions were forced to choose fight or flight, ultimately choosing to fight. But this feeling of exhaustion that higher education leadership feels due to the efforts they needed to place to keep the business of higher education alive is the exact same feeling students of color experience navigating an environment that to this day still feels it isn't for them. This feeling was exacerbated during the pandemic. So what did that research tell us? What we know about the pandemic's consequences for education so far helps us plan the next steps. Learning and holistic development have been interrupted and disrupted for millions of students. An effective response to assist students academically is the use of tools to meet each student where he, she, they are, and to devise a plan for making up for the interruption. Additionally, providing unconventional ways for them to receive academic advising, mental and health wellness checks are essential. The pandemic also exacerbated well-documented opportunity gaps that put low-income students at a disadvantage relative to their better-off peers. Opportunity gaps are gaps in access to the conditions and resources that enhance learning and development, and include access to food, housing, health insurance, and care, as well as financial relief measures. One of the most critical opportunity gaps is the uneven access to devices and internet access critical to learning online. The digital divide was real. It was made it virtually impossible for some students to learn during the pandemic. In the face of the current pandemic, colleges and universities needed to devise strategies to adapt to an extraordinarily uncertain environment, not just to address the immediate crisis, but the longer term. 7 principles should underlie the post-coronavirus decision-making, and such decisions should be focused on equity, accessibility, affordability, outcomes, focus, flexibility, resiliency, and sustainability. Achieving those objectives will require a willingness to think outside traditional boxes. We must be innovative, adaptive, and proactive. We need to push the status quo. In creating more resilient institutions, we not only need to be able to respond more nimbly and successfully to crises and to shifting student needs. Many working students and family caregivers need an education better tailored to their complicated lives. Some steps forward seem obvious. All student services should be accessible remotely. All classes should have a robust online component. Course materials need to meet accessibility standards and be available electronically. However, the institution should have a contingency plan for the students who do not have access to devices or stable internet use, as well as a contingency plan for educators and administrators. We need to think more intentionally about educating the whole student. The crisis should remind us that our institutions must not only promote students' cognitive development, but their well-being, including their mental health and physical wellness. Providing resources to students' health services so that students have access during times of crisis is essential. Partnering with local organizations for support can be an avenue. Additionally, we were also faced with the very real racial challenges faced by our communities of color on campus and our inability to support them. The very thing that we shy away from discussing reared its ugly head, and many campuses failed at providing basic support. Since the pandemic, we have seen an increase in institutional efforts to advance their DEI initiatives by creating task force, committees, and hiring chief diversity officers, all while at times providing very little financial and staff support. While this is all important to create an inclusive and social justice-driven campus, structural changes within the institution are needed, not performative actions or performative allyship. What is performative allyship, right? Performative allyship became the order of the day. It has become a recurring theme in recent times, with many in leadership positions quick to lend rhetorical support to diversity and inclusion, particularly in the area of race equality. With the onset of global reactions to the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, just to name a few, leaders who were once reticent in championing racial equality have found their voices in an attempt to align to racial equity and express solidarity with the cause. Far from being supportive of an anti-racist agenda, performative allyship has a disturbing influence which stifles progress and has a detrimental effect of suppressing attempts to foster genuinely inclusive environments. So what is it and how does it look? Allyship is an authentic support system, right, in which someone from outside a marginalized group advocates for those who are victims of discriminatory behavior, whether that is at an individual level or systemically and process-driven. With authentic allyship, there's an obvious and genuine attempt to transfer the benefits of privilege to those who lack it. to advocate on the marginalized groups' behalf and support them to achieve change. Performative allyship, however, by contrast, is where those with privilege profess solidarity with a cause. This assumed solidarity is usually vocalized, disingenuous, and potentially harmful to marginalized groups. Often, the performative ally professes allegiance in order to distance themselves from potential scrutiny. In many cases, organizational leaders use performance-driven activity in a way that they believe will protect the environment or the brand from being highlighted in a negative way. It is often referred to as a talking the talk without walking the walk. So how do we ensure that our actions are not aligned with performative allyship? What does this mean when discussing the importance of cultural inclusion and creating an inclusive environment where all students are heard, seen, and valued? Campus administrators can play a vital role in addressing the inequities highlighted during the pandemic. The everyday administrative practice of social justice on campus can include lecture series, programs created to help instructors and others on campus engage in continued conversations about complex and difficult issues. Programs in part sponsored by campus administrators like Difficult Dialogues and Critical Conversation Series are programs in which university administrators are involved in promoting discussions about social justice issues, helping university stakeholders really and truly think critically on those issues and developing strategies for further conversation and action. Additionally, these programs are an ongoing opportunity for community dialogue on important issues. Addressing social justice and diversity issues in the classroom is another important everyday practice in higher education. College students are expected to learn about diversity issues in their academic programs, and preparing students for being active participants in a diverse global society has to be incorporated into the college curricula. Knowing this, our office began reviewing course offerings that could be identified as DEI-SJ courses, that's diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice courses, for which students can take to expand their knowledge and get tools helpful in a global world. Our office is also creating a series of workshops for faculty and course instructors, including graduate students, focused on helping develop instructors' expertise in teaching and assessing the general education outcome and creating assignments that are useful for eliciting critical thinking about diversity and equity issues. Co-curricular programs have been found to help to contribute to students' academic, civic, and personal outcomes, including understanding people from different backgrounds, engaging in reflective dialogue about diversity issues, and developing a sense of connection with people previously thought to be different than themselves. Programs like the Tunnel of Oppression is an example of a continuing proactive co-curricular program that helps bring awareness to social justice issues on campus and in society at large. Assessment, which is very important, of student learning is a common activity on college campuses. The data gained from assessment is critical for accreditation, accountability, program improvement, and decision-making. On our campus, one of the critical assessment activities that occurs at the university level is the assessment of general education learning outcomes. So how do we get that data and implement it to DEI-SJ work? Cultural inclusion has to move to the forefront. Creating a diverse and inclusive environment is not only the right thing to do, but it benefits us in a variety of ways. It fosters a healthy work and campus environment. It increases engagement and productivity. When people are comfortable and can express themselves in an authentic way, they're more likely to perform better, which increases engagement and contributes to the overall organization. Having a diverse and inclusive environment can help in terms of creativity and innovation. When individuals' distinctive background and experience is celebrated and encouraged, they are more likely to voice their unique perspectives. This can lead to new ideas, improved operations, and innovative solutions when discussing our students' retention. What are some additional tactics? Develop a consensus of the inequity within the institution and the system. The biggest challenge in creating trust and support is that there's always a but. If white passing students, faculty, and staff do not believe that racism is an issue within the institution, then all initiatives related to creating an inclusive space are null and void. Use the data available to you, both quantitative and qualitative, to build awareness and agreements around the problems. Next, remember that representation matters. In creating a culture where students, faculty, and staff feel welcome, we must see ourselves and lived experiences in all spaces. Committing to recruiting a more diverse freshman class demands that we also recruit and elevate a more diverse workforce. As leaders in your respective units, consider challenging the conversation by asking each other and those in positions of authority what can be done, what has and what hasn't been done. Listen to those who are being affected. Within higher education, we know that people of color are less likely than their white counterparts to be in senior decision-making positions. Oftentimes, students and staff of color are spoken about, but not spoken with. To improve an organization's culture, understanding the current state of the culture should be gathered. Thus, it matters to give a seat and a voice at the table. This will provide our BIPOC community to control their own narrative and share their lived experiences. To do this, spend time understanding what is working for students, what could improve, and what is required that is currently lacking. Be prepared to be comfortable being uncomfortable, as the goal of these should be to get a clear, honest, transparent view of what's working and learning at the organization is like from those on the ground, whether positive, indifferent, or negative. Next, provide action, but don't expect us to do the work. Post-listening phase, form a plan of how to tackle what you have heard. This step is crucial. Otherwise, engagement will decrease due to all talk, no action. And action can take many forms. If students and colleagues are raising that they do not feel a sense of belonging, determine how you can help foster an environment of inclusion. Perhaps creating affinity or resource groups can potentially help people come together, meet like-minded people, and therefore find their place in their campus environment. Senior leaders should engage in reciprocal mentoring. Furthermore, forming partnerships with external organizations dedicated to highlighting, supporting, and empowering underrepresented people can aid a positive shift in culture. Do not become complacent. In higher education, we are risk adverse. Therefore, we are less willing to confront racism or injustices. Oftentimes, solely expecting diversity offices to solve the problem rather than working with a diversity office. It is important that we hold ourselves accountable and are transparent. Racial equity cuts across every single structure in higher education. It shouldn't solely be the issue of the diversity office, but rather a part of every single unit, a part of the fabric of the institution. Lastly, the chances for our students to be successful is if we understand that the principle of equity is being applied across curriculum design. Our curriculum framework and how we offer our services should be built on anti-discriminatory practices and pedagogies. Examine your structure, processes, and co-design our curricula and services with students so they can give us insight on how they experience a disadvantage and discrimination. Performative allyship does not engage in a complex level. It consists of low-level, often ill-informed rhetorical statements that are usually obvious to Black and BIPOC individuals and real allies of the anti-racist and racially inclusive agenda. It lacks genuine concern and does little to acknowledge the very behaviors that support structural and process-driven racism. Therefore, it is essential for leaders to adopt an anti-racist stance that embodies real and authentic support for the race equality agenda. BIPOC individuals have heard it all before, with the level of focus around race equality being maintained by the Black community and their allies, leadership may wish to consider anti-racist solutions for driving the race equality agenda forward. It is simply not enough to be woke. This is what the pandemic showed us, and make performative statements. It is time to listen to the concerns of students and colleagues who continue to suffer under systems that are in place to ensure that they remain marginalized. Anti-racism is a part of the solution for race equality and must form part of knowledge building activities for behavioral change to support a truly authentic and inclusive environment. An organization's culture should continually evolve. To ensure the culture is continually underpinned by embracing diversity and respectful behaviors, a two-way line communication must be open between faculty, staff, and students, which in itself is a sign of positive culture. Be comfortable in having thoughts challenged. Remember, the common goal of forming an environment is to support, promote, and hear all voices. We must address issues such as equity, social, and environmental justice in a collaborative and integrated manner. For higher education to authentically contribute to just recovery, we need to listen to those most affected, giving them not just a seat at the table, but inviting them to co-create the future. Addressing educational inequities has been the focus of institutional diversity, equity, and inclusion operations for years. However, the recent triple crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, the systemic racism in this country, and racial inequities in higher education has prompted a clear call for more effective strategies that will result in more equitable outcomes for underrepresented populations by placing DEI at the core of our institutional practice. By promoting the importance of a diverse campus, adopting an equity-minded approach to leadership, and facilitating greater inclusion, institutional leaders can ensure that our institutions deliver on the nation's promise of higher education for all students. I will stop there because I talked a lot and I talked really fast. I would like to engage in some discussion. I appreciate you all for listening.
Dr. Randolph. Oh, go ahead. Who's there? Oh, I thought so. Okay. I'll just because we had a conversation prior to, and you coming from a really diverse university such as how do you plan to navigate the landscape of Louisiana and LSU?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it is hard to navigate the work that we do anyway in any space, right? The University of Miami is a private institution. So while we are still legally bound by certain things, we are certainly have a different way and a different environment or ways that we can get to talk about different things and do different things. And Florida is a different state than Louisiana, right? Navigating the space, I always say, it doesn't matter where you are at. What you have to do, the ultimate goal is you want to see the change, right? We have a lot of discussions regarding critical race theory and the word anti-racist and the word social justice, right? And everyone's focused on the actual word rather than the meaning behind it and the work that's already existing in some spaces that are anti-racist, that are social justice, that are CRT related, right? What I tell students and what I tell folks is my job is to provide more access, to be more equitable, to ensure that we see the spaces that isn't happening and bringing both sides of the party to the center. And sometimes it's not going to happen as quickly as we want it to be, but that's the end goal. And navigating how we do this work at LSU and in Louisiana, it will require far much more conversation because there's a completely different type of environment and culture here than there is in the state of Florida, right? In particular in Miami and in Tampa, where I came from. So, yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I have a question. I find when we're looking at DEIJ work, those that need to not have a seat at the table, but be present at the table when we're having these rich discussions are the ones that refuse to be present at the table when we're having these rich discussions. What advice do you have for, I don't even want to say like creating buy-in, but just getting ears, getting people to listen to everything you said and why it's so important?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest issues or the biggest eye-opening things that happened during the pandemic is that people who were not being affected by what was happening, not only health-wise with the pandemic, but just racially in our country, were sort of surprised, right? They were like surprised that some folks didn't have enough access to health, or that they didn't have access to, daycare, or they didn't have access to, food, right? Imagine how many children went without because of what happened at the pandemic. But there were people that were surprised of that. And then they were surprised on top of all the murders that occurred during that time, right? It is those individuals who were surprised that we have an opportunity to not necessarily, I agree with you, Dr. Kim, not necessarily have buy-in, they understand. The concept here is that people see it, they realize it's happening, but they're focusing on themselves, right? Because everything is very self-serving. So when we're talking about how do we get people to the table or how do we create an opportunity where everybody sees where we're coming from, truth be told, lived experiences can only be transferred so much, right? Your lived experience as someone who may identify as a person of color or a Black woman, and I'm making that assumption fully, so I apologize if that's not your identity, right? It's going to be completely different than mine, right? And at times, when we're already having these discussions and these topics, people already have checked us off because of their preconceived biases. oh, they're an angry Black woman. Or, well, that's different because that happened there, but it doesn't happen here. It's not until it happens within the campus, then people start really saying, okay, what are we doing? So let's take, for example, at LSU over the summer of unrest, I was not here, but it was part of my discussion and part of my interview, the summer of unrest and the students' demands on renaming buildings, right? Students were engaged and were really passionate about ensuring that we no longer place ourselves in positions in an environment where racist behavior was accepted, or that racism, the history of racism, was still standing and very free, right? Having the students bring in these conversations to leadership helped us greatly, right? Because it allowed for us as the administrators to step back and saying, we have to strategically figure out a way that we acknowledge the past of this institution, but we move forward in how we're gonna do this, right? And I always tell students are powerful. They think they're not, but I'm like, you are far much more powerful than the people who are working for you and with you, because you are here, you're transient, you get to come in and you get to come out. So you get to make some differences. But in this example, we did have successfully removed the name of the library, right? Now, the next step to that, right, is how do we create a space where we have a strategy on what that looks like, not only for the naming of the library, but the policies and the processes that come along with that. Because renaming the library is one thing, but it doesn't change what may be happening in the undercore of it all, right? The access that's being prevented for some students, right? The policies or processes that may be in place that may not allow us to elevate or bring in more people of color, or see different spaces in different manners. So I think it's more about, it's a really long answer, but I wanted to touch upon that. I think it's more about the fact that I don't want to say we need different messengers, because I think the messengers are right. The messaging needs to be the same, but is the intent versus the impact. And it's who are you talking to as well, right? If we have individuals who've been in this culture for so long and don't understand that a name can bring such an impact to an individual, it begs to differ, should this individual even be a part of our culture, right? We've had students who have experienced over the last few weeks, even, the last few days, where white students have dropped the N-word. And I have physically seen the impact of that student, knowing that they have to go to class every single day with that individual, and that individual, nothing can happen to them. Why? Because of freedom of speech, right? So how do we provide support to our students, and how do we provide support to our administrators to feel that they have the ability to make a difference, right? And then bringing people to the center is always going to be important. The challenge is that the people don't want to come to the center because one is self-serving, but they're focused on the wrong language. People are, we don't want CRT, we don't want anti-racist agenda, we don't want XYZ. And I'm like, but we're doing it. We're already doing the work. This is the actual term for it, but they're focusing on the wrong thing. So that's my full scope of it. I'm all about bringing people to the center. And I'm also telling you very clearly, and I said this in my interview, is I'm also about ruffling the feathers, because some people are not going to come to the center, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to be doing the work. We have to do the work no matter what. So you don't want to come to the center, that's perfectly fine. We are a federally funded institution. We understand our limitations, but if you want to bring in a more diverse freshman class, then you need to bring a more diverse faculty, staff, and administrators to this campus. If you want to see more faculty of color being tenured, you need to change some policies and some processes. If you want to see more students come onto this campus and not feel that this environment isn't for them, then you need to create an environment that allows for students to feel welcome and to feel supported. And students of color will only see that when they see themselves in the spaces that they're not.
Thank you so much.
Anyone else have a question?
I have a quick question. First of all, thank you. I've loved your talk. A lot of the things that you've been talking about, it sounds like is from like the university as a whole perspective, all of which could be directly applied within athletics as well. And so I'm kind of wondering what your opinion, advice would be about how athletics, which on predominantly white institutions is usually the most diverse department, to get athletics more involved in kind of the bigger picture of the whole university. Like, how can athletics incorporate some of the things that you're saying within their own department, but then also be part of the bigger solution on campus?
So I'm glad that you asked that, Liz, and thank you so much. First of all, when I was doing this talk, I was like, oh my God, it's 15 minutes. I don't know how I'm going to get this through, but I'm glad you asked this question, because one of the things that athletics has is exactly what you said, right? In a predominantly white institution, your athletic department, as far as your student, right, population, is far much more diverse than your regular campus student population, right? You have the ability to really create an environment that allows for mutual respect, but mutual ownership. And I think one of the things that the LSU athletics department did here, which I'm going to go briefly over because I wasn't a part of it from the beginning, but when they realized what happened with the summer of unrest in 2020, when they realized that there was a huge impact to their students, right? And realization isn't the correct word, but when they knew students are really aching here, we really need to support them, they really went back as a group and started having these listening sessions. They started really doing a climate survey. I would suggest that you do a departmental climate survey. And if you don't have a tool, if your institution, Office of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, or the equivalent to that, doesn't have a tool, I highly suggest that you reach out to the LSU athletics department and talk to them as to who they utilize. They use 2 faculty members here, and they really did an incredible job in creating the tool, but then in creating not only the tool, the questions and the information that came out of that, right? Because then it then provided really the roadmap for them to start thinking about, okay, what are our core values? How do we come together when we see injustices? What is the support system that we're not only providing to our student athletes, whether that is student organizations within the athletic department, support system and collaborative partnerships across campus, but also for our staff? What are we doing, right? Because what you're going to do there is you become your own sort of test group. And then once you've worked all that out, you have something that you can present to your institution as a test trial. This is what we did, and this is what we found, and this is our plan moving forward. I think most individuals want to kind of, what's the saying? There's the elephant, you just want to eat the elephant all at once, right? Instead of taking one piece at a time. I don't suggest you eat an elephant, I'm just saying, right? But you're taking one piece at a time to get to that space. And I think that's where we lose ourselves when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we should think holistically, we should think the entire campus, but we should start somewhere. And if your athletic departments can start there, that'd be great. I will also suggest, if your institution doesn't have a DEI strategic plan, if your DEI office doesn't have a strategic plan, and or if your athletic department doesn't have a DEI unit that cannot tell you exactly what their goals are or what their initiatives are, then this will be a great time for you to engage them and involve them in that process as well. Because chances are that they have some initiatives that you can kind of bounce off of and talk to. But once you have that data, you'll be able to compare that.
Dr. Randolph, I have one more question.
Yeah.
So you talked about the power of the student. And one thing that I've kind of noticed during the height of everything during the pandemic, they were rah on board and let's roll. And that's on camp regular student population as well as the student athlete. But it seems like now that everything seems to have gone back to normal, that rah has disappeared. How do you rally the troops again?
So I'm glad you say that. I had this discussion with a friend surrounding Colin Kaepernick and how the community rallied or didn't rally around them, and then how it's died down, right? And nothing has died down, right? There's still things happening. People, Black men, Black individuals are still being killed unjustly, right? And nobody should be killed, but the Black community is suffering, and we're still seeing that, right? I think the reason why it feels that it's died down is because when we were in the midst of the pandemic, everybody was like, yep, you can get this. Yep, you can get that. Students need this, let's do that. We need a chief diversity officer, let's that. Anything with racial equity, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion was approved with no questions asked, right? So things started to being approved and there was no real strategy behind implementation. So then our students really started looking at it as like, well, what are we doing? Like, we gave you all lists of these demands and you're telling us yes, and now we're waiting for those demands or those actions to be put, those demands to be put into action, right? The reason it feels like it's died down from the student perspective is because one, students are transient, but also students haven't seen enough effort. If your students haven't seen enough effort, that's a problem. We're also not being transparent, right? Because students want to see change immediately. We live in a world where if you take a picture, you can upload it to Facebook or social media, right? Immediately and get likes or get a comment right away, right? They live in an instant gratification world. We live in a world where we have to answer to it. Even if you're the president of the institution, you still have to answer to someone, right? So we need to be transparent and continuously engage these students, right? Hey, this was the list of demands that you provided. We are 3 months in and this is where we're at. Let me tell you what our challenges are, right? Challenges that no student can really help us with, but then these are the challenges that you can help us with. Engaging them through the process for some institutions hasn't been as great because you're going through the motions because you have no other choice, right? You're going through the motions. It's to bring them back into it, to get that rah going. I suggest for every single institution that had some sort of demonstration or demands by students, bring those students back to the table. Tell them where you are at. Make sure that you are the ones that make that first step, because I always say this to my mom, regardless of how old I am, right? I'm always going to be the kid. She's always going to be the parent. In this case, they're always going to be the student. We're always going to be the administrators, right? So bringing them back and telling them where we're at. Also realizing that if students are transient, some students this might have been an individual endeavor rather than a student group endeavor. So what was the transition of that power as well? Because some students may be completely aloof of what's going on, especially those students who started college in the pandemic. I mean, they weren't on campus, right? So they don't know no different. They don't know of any marches. They don't know of anything else. They just know what's happening or what they saw. So that's what I would say. I would say, look at those lists of demands, bring those students back in, be transparent in your communication, and really work to strategize. And honestly, bring the people that should be that are the experts on your campus to that discussion, because oftentimes they are brought in, but they may not be the ones leading the discussion, and they need to be, because they are the experts.
Well, don't be surprised if you're contacted by BSAA here. So I've had some of the members kind of ask me that question. So yeah, you may be getting some emails. So
I love it.
Any other questions?
Another question. It's more in terms of administration, and those of us who are supportive of students who are going through equity, diversity issues, they tend to tell their friends, and then we become the support system for a large group of students who are facing similar issues. And there's kind of a support fatigue that comes with that. I don't want to say burden, because it's a blessing as well that we have this connection with students, but talking about so many heavy issues all of the time, and that burden, that responsibility is not being shared among other parts of administration. What advice do you have for faculty, staff members that are placed in that position?
Dr. Kemp, I cannot tell you that you sharing that just automatically brought me back to the day I had to have several conversations with a few of my Black students virtually, because we were not on campus. And I was mustering everything that I had in me to be there for them, to be as positive as I possibly could, to provide them the resources and support. But in the back of my head, all I kept thinking is my then husband at that time and my son are hated. And I don't know how to navigate the discussion with my students when I'm feeling this, right? I am a wholehearted believer that people don't understand that this work, all of our jobs are exhausting, right? But imagine having to be a person of color and walking into a space and have to validate your existence, not only as a human, but then validate your existence as a professional, and then validate your existence as to why this work is important. We have triple the pressure on us, right? So I say this to say that we as administrators, the ones that are doing this work, need to challenge our other administrators, our faculty and staff, because this work cannot be done alone. This space cannot be shared alone. We are quote unquote experts. Expert for me is now a word where I'm like, every day is something new. So I don't know that we're experts, right? And I'm an expert on my dissertation. That's it. That's about the only expertise I have, right? But we are tagged with doing this work and we're hired for this work. So there are certain things that we're going to know versus our other colleagues, right? But challenge our colleagues and challenge our units to say, these are the things that I am experiencing as an administrator, and this is why it's heavy. Let me tell you what I think we need to do so that DEI is seen as a fabric of the institution. Not everyone's a DEI expert here, but everyone's a DEI supporter. They understand what needs to happen, and students feel like they're safe, right? And that's how we need to start. As faculty, staff, and administrators, we need to challenge each other, because at some point, all of the underrepresented, marginalized faculty, staff, and administrators are going to be exhausted. And it's going to come to a point where that work will be challenging, and it's challenging our existence, which it already is. And we're not going to be able to be on the side of the institution because we're just as exhausted as the students. So if I can provide any suggestion, is look into your Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, talk to them and seeing in your academic affairs, and talk to them and seeing, how do we provide more support and training and workshops to everyone on campus? How do we make this highly requested, not mandatory, because we can't make DEI stuff mandatory, but highly requested? How do we embed it into their evaluation, right? Because then now, guess what we're doing? We're not performing the whole thing. We are actually challenging the process behind it. And we're actively doing that here. It's a work in progress, right? But we're actively doing that here. So that's what I would do. Let's challenge each other. And the people who do this work, when we walk into a space, we got to remember, I say this all of the time. I want to make sure I say, okay. I say this all the time. When I walk into a space, I know for a fact people are like, here comes a diversity girl. She's going to talk about diversity and kill it with the diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And you're right. I'm going to probably talk to you in that manner. So sometimes we need those allies to help us navigate those discussions, because our record is already broken. We need a new record to be played.
Thank you so much.
All righty, well, we're gonna kind of wind up. Dr. Randolph, that was an amazing session. Again, don't be surprised if you're getting calls from some of the student athletes.
Well, we're gonna go to the Jamaican restaurant together. So
yes, we do. We gotta go to the Royal Taste of Jamaica. I am not a fan of bullfish. If somebody told you about that, they're too salty. But yes, we definitely will. And I just think too, the whole discussion, I think with the comment of, I think with athletics and the university as a whole, it should be, they operate separately, but they are a university as one. And I think the fact that we need to do more effort in collaborating and making sure that the message is across the board.
Yeah, because the student athletes are not students just at athletics. They're not taking classes.
They're students, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much.